and Dr. Tim Anderson, who is a specialist in anti-hegemony, head of the Anti-Hegemony Center in Sydney. Welcome on the show. And you are participating in a conference in support of Palestine. And for an Arab like myself, who is aware of the huge propaganda of the mainstream media in both the United States and in Australia, what makes you support the Palestinian cause? We start with you, Dr. Scott.
Well, for me, it was discovering that the media in America and the politicians in America have lied about the entire Palestinian issue, and of course, the Israeli Zionists and the Mossad inventing lies. And as an officer in the Army, I swore to uphold the oath to the Constitution, and I saw this ongoing campaign of lies and corruption greatly damaging my country. And I thought, Americans need to go and be informed about what is happening. And I chose to come, and what I've seen and learned has been quite amazing. And the other thing that occurred to me is, in today's situation, we have so many people, for example, running to support Ukraine as freedom fighters, as suffering people who have a right to resist the Russians. Well, if that is the logic, then you have to say, too, that you support the Palestinians, who are honestly resisting a murderous genocide for 20-some years, if not longer. So the hypocrisy in America is something that I want to attack and say, if you support the Ukrainian situation, then you have to support Palestine, unless you're a racist, unless you're an Islamophobe. And that's not to say Ukraine is right. I think Ukraine is a complete Nazi regime that is a U.S. puppet that has been engaged in war crimes and crimes against humanity, dealing in biochemical warfare labs. I know, I was part of the documentary that exposed it. So Ukraine is a very wicked, insane regime, but it draws an interesting parallel to say the American people and the people of Western society need to recognize that there are true freedom fighters and struggles that are going on. And it's not in Ukraine, it's in Palestine. And if Christian people in Europe and the United States have a heart, they will support Palestine and stop the genocide that's been falling upon them.
Well, quite interesting, thank you. Dr. Tim, what makes you an Australian, coming from a faraway country, to show support to the Palestinian cause? What made you adopt this stance towards the Palestinian cause?
Yes, like Scott, there's a period after which the amount of lies that are told about the foreign operations, because we have an army which doesn't operate to defend its country. Unlike the Syrian army which defends Syria, the Australian army has been a collaborator, a small-time collaborator with the US the whole of my life. At school, there was the Vietnam War. I got involved in demonstrations against that. Unlike Scott, I never wanted to join my army. I realized that they were only involved in foreign military operations. And then the lies of the Vietnam War. I still remember, for example, that there were peace talks in 1968.
Yeah.
7 years before the war ended. Millions of people died after the US knew, and its collaborators, like Australia, knew that they'd lost that war. And that horrified me as a young person. And then, of course, after that, there were many, many wars. And the level of lies, and particularly as an educator, having spent more than 30 years in universities teaching and researching, you feel some responsibility as an educator to... sometimes it's difficult to deal with contemporary issues because the media is so overwhelming with the lies that they put on people. But at some stage, if you have a conscience as an educator, you have to think about how to deal with those lies and how to help the next generation of young people deal with those lies within our own culture. This is before it comes to the question of actually travelling to other cultures and being in solidarity with other peoples. But so there is a responsibility, I believe, in your own culture to deal with that level of deception about ongoing colonisation, about ongoing war.
Well, Dr. Tim, we know very well that there are a lot of people among the elite, let's say university professors, writers, political thinkers who might have an objective perception of the Palestinian cause. But when it comes to the general public that are bombarded by, let's say, mainstream media, how do you evaluate the public stance in Australia towards the Palestinian cause, and to what extent your efforts are being fruitful in making breakthroughs into the public's mind?
Well, with the Palestinian cause is really an exceptional example of Arab nationalism, effectively. And there's a great deal of goodwill being built up over a long period of time. So there's a broad level, I would say, let's say in the English-speaking world, of support for Palestinians in a passive way. That is, Palestinians as victims, so long as they do not raise their fists, so long as they don't raise a weapon against the colonizers, which our governments support, basically. And then you have another hurdle that comes along. And here we have a great deal of fear and censorship and repression of voices who want to say, well, it's not just that I support Palestinians, I support their right to resist too, to resist the colonizing power, to resist an apartheid regime. And that's where the pressure rises in our societies, and there is what do you say, retaliation against people who say that, because it's really a red line for Western cultures, English-speaking cultures, for people to support the right of the Palestinians to resist, the right of the regional Arab countries to support the resistance in Palestine, to reject the interventions in the various wars, particularly in recent years.
We will go more in depth into the issue of active resistance. But first I would like to ask Dr. Scott about the situation in the United States. And we know very well that the Israeli lobby is very strong in the United States, AIPAC, and its control of the media is even much stronger than in Australia, for example. To what extent, yet we see people like yourself who are being able to elaborate an objective perception of the Palestinian cause. But to what extent this is general among the elite on one hand, and to what extent you're being able to make breakthroughs in order to win or let's say present your ideas and perspective to the general public in the United States?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is if the American people knew what I knew what Tim knew what many others who have come to Lebanon and Palestine and studied this issue knew, the American people would be on the side of the Palestinians.
Yeah.
The American people have in their hearts to be on the side of the oppressed and to liberate the oppressed. But they do not know the truth of what's going on. And that's breaking through. They are beginning to learn because of what the Zionist, Israeli, Jewish control of America means is they control the media, they bribe our politicians, they blackmail our politicians, they blackmail them with sexual entrapment, like Jeffrey Epstein, who was a Mossad operative that with Ghislaine Maxwell would entrap politicians in compromising situations. They do that throughout America, and they've captured many posts in the media and Hollywood and politics. And that being said, the Israeli Jewish Zionist side are also on the side of the moral degeneracy in America, the lesbian, gay, transgender agenda, the homosexual parades, the homosexuality being taught in schools. Well, the American people are against all of that. They are a moral conservative people. And when they see this decadence, this rot, this decay, they want to expel it. That's why they vote conservative Republican. That's why they voted for Trump. That's why they don't like Joe Biden. And they are rebelling against a lot of the rot and the decay in America. And for that reason, they're rejecting the media. So there's new media that is rising up, new broadcasters, new social media platforms that are telling the truth, and that's having an effect. So it's not the mainstream media anymore that is really influencing the smart people. It is the social media, the Rumbles and the Odysseys and the Press TV and the RT and the alternative sources. So the smartest of the American people recognize the deceit and the decay and the debauchery of the Israeli Zionist control, and they reject the Israeli control in America. They reject the APAC, the American Israeli Political Action Conference. They're rejecting a lot of their own politicians who have been behind this Zionist operation in Palestine. So that gives me a lot of hope that things are changing. And the more people that are out speaking the truth, the more platforms and channels and opportunities to articulate the Palestinian issue, the more American people and other people in Europe, in Australia, and Britain, and Germany, and France are going to come to the side of the Palestinians. And I think the multipolar world, as President Putin has been articulating, as we see the slow decay of the West, America, Britain, France, Germany, all of these European countries falling apart by their own political suicide, led by the United States, who is trying to destroy the Nord Stream pipeline and freeze them all to make them little weak vassal states. I think you're seeing a great awakening happening, and that great awakening is going to be more in favor of a multipolar world, in favor of Palestine, in favor of anything that throws off the Zionist control of America and many parts of Europe. So there's a great upheaval that's about to happen, and we're just on the front lines.
Well, in this regard, if we recall the ups and downs of support towards the Palestinian cause, prior, for example, to 2001, the attacks on New York, etc., we had huge support in the West for the Palestinian cause. However, the incident or the attacks on New York and Washington at the time made or caused the rise of Islamophobia in the West.
Yes.
And this Islamophobia damaged to a large extent the Palestinian cause. To what extent you think that the public in the United States and in the West has been able to overcome this and to try to see the Palestinian cause for what it is rather than mixing it up with Islamic terrorism?
Yes.
Quote unquote.
I think you said something very important, and that is the shift away from seeing Palestine in a supportive way occurred on the 9/11 attacks. Now, the 9/11 attacks were a fraudulent false flag attack that was orchestrated by the Zionist Mossad, the US CIA, the Saudi intelligence services, and the British MI6. I know, I studied it, I was in the Army. So that false flag event, which anyone with reason in their mind can look at the physical events and say it's impossible for the Twin Towers to be turned into dust by planes. No, it was a nuclear detonation in the core of the Twin Towers. It is impossible for Building 7, the Solomon Building, where they had many financial records, to collapse into its own footprint because of a fire. It's impossible for the Pentagon to be hit by a plane and yet no plane wreckage be anywhere on the grass. So the American people know that 9/11 was a fraud. They know it was the greatest crime in the history of civilization, because from that crime that the Zionist, Jewish, Israeli Benjamin Netanyahu and a variety of other Zionists, like my boss, Dov Zakheim, who I worked for, along with Ed Snowden at Booz Allen Hamilton, the Zionists in the Project for a New American Century, Paul Wolfowitz, Pearl, Dick Cheney, Tim's favorite guy, many, many other of these Zionists in the Project for a New American Century set up the 9/11 event as the catalyst for an American juggernaut through the Middle East, to take out Afghanistan, to take out Iraq, to take out Libya, to take out Syria, to take out Iran and Lebanon. But all of that has fallen short. It started in 2000. It started actually before that, but they triggered it in 2000, 2001, and it stopped, essentially in the last few years. Yeah. And I think American people have yet to fully rise up and punish the people responsible for 9/11 And they're discovering it. So as they discover the crimes and the lies that were done against the people of the world as well as America, they will become much more sympathetic with Palestine. Now, I've been to Iran, I've been to other Islamic countries, and I can say as an American Christian that the Islamic people of the world are closer and more friendlier and more loving towards Christian people than any other people that I've encountered. And I find them like brothers and children of God. And I think the more American people discover the truth of that, they too will see the Islamic people, not as people to be feared, but victims of the lies that the Zionists have told about them.
Well, Dr. Tim, we raised the issue of Islamophobia and using Islam as a pretext for attacks on Arab and Muslim countries. To what extent you think that this was used by mainstream elites in the West and in your own country in Australia to promote a certain geopolitical agenda throughout the Arab Islamic world as a mean for imposing or maintaining hegemony in the world, Western hegemony?
Yes, there's no doubt that particular ways of dividing people are used by empires historically. I would say I disagree with some of the approaches Scott uses, but I come to some similar conclusions about US decline, for example. One thing is in relation to the role of the Zionists. I don't believe that the Zionist tail wags the imperial dog. I think that the US is a dominant power. It asserts itself over its so-called allies. Israel is a Zionist colony that the British created, but it's also a forward base for, it was a forward base for British imperialism, now US imperialism. And I think that we have to remember that the central logic is US imperialism here, and that's important, I think, in the future to see as the contradictions ripen in relation to the Israeli colony and its constant fear of being let down, of being betrayed by the US, for example. In constant fear of that, it's worried about it, it's trying to provoke the US into a war with Iran, for example, which it can't do itself, you know. So it's true that they have a lot of influence in the US, within the US, there's no doubt about that. They are not your typical normal colony. Probably they have more influence than the former apartheid South Africa, although there are some other interesting parallels with apartheid South Africa, which was nuclear armed, which was thought to be invincible, that had the full support of Britain and the US. But I think that the Israeli colony is more fragile than that. Now, when it comes to Western public opinion, I'm a bit less optimistic than Scott because, and I don't come from the same US conservative values perspective as him, but I do also have this concern about Western liberalism or hyperliberalism, which is leading the current administration, for example, the Biden administration, or whoever's behind Biden, whoever's making the decisions, because he's really doesn't seem to be really very capable intellectually these days, is that how would they possibly lose a war against Syria and then go to war against Iran, Russia and China at the same time? And this is something to do with this hyperliberalism, an arrogant, it's a faction of imperialism within US. You have what you might call realist imperialism, where they say what they're going to do, the George Bush type invasion of Iraq, and then you have this so-called smart power that the Hillary Clintons and the Obamas of the world have done, where they think someone else will fight our war for us, someone else will pay for our war, we'll hire all these stupid young men, mercenaries, to go and carry out a war and say they're liberating Libya or Syria or whoever it is, basically. And that has led to the proliferation of war to an extraordinary extent at a time when the US is economically in decline and fearing the loss of its influence in Asia, the loss of its influence in Europe, and then, of course, sacrificing its so-called European allies in the process of trying to use this neo-fascist Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. So that is on the state side of things. Now, on the popular side of things, Scott expresses a lot of optimism about the North American people. I worry that as someone who looks at how the propaganda, how the war propaganda, how the Islamophobia has affected English-speaking populations in particular, that it's not just that they are misinformed. Certainly they're misinformed. Certainly there are new regimes of censorship which are rather extreme. You know, the banning of, or the branding of, the blocking of all of the media from Venezuela, from Cuba, from Russia, from Iran, from wherever the new threat is seen to be, from China, for example, that there is still a predisposition amongst Western liberal populations, still a neo-colonial idea that they really believe that they can play some role in liberating people in other countries from their own systems. You know, the idea of liberating Libya from the Gaddafi regime, liberating Syria from the Syrian regime, liberating Iran from the mullahs. You know, this strikes a chord in Western liberalism. They think, yes, we can help Iranian women. You know, that somehow it's to do with the scarf, how the scarf is worn in Iran. It somehow appeals to a sense of superiority, arrogance, and a neo-colonial mentality, particularly amongst Western liberals, which helps them in this type of war. So I feel it's a much greater challenge, actually, at a popular level. It's not just a question of being misinformed, for example, about the current proxy war that's being carried out against Iran, for example, which looks very similar to the beginnings of the proxy war against Syria. You know, I think Iran, of course, Iran is a much bigger, stronger
actually,
state.
What you're saying is not limited to Arab and Islamic countries, but we see the same being tried against anti-imperialist countries such as Venezuela or Cuba, where there are no, where the rulers at least, or the majority of the people are Christians. And this also leads me to ask you about the reason why, despite using Islamophobia, or let's say as a propaganda tool in order to promote a certain agenda in the Arab Islamic world, why Christian religious groups are targeted by the same groups that are supported by the West, whereas we see these religious groups being protected by the axis of resistance, for example.
Yeah. Look, it's not to do with a particular religion. It's to do with any device that will divide people. You know, the British concluded in a special inquiry after the first war of independence in India in the 1850s that they needed to divide the Indian people. The Romans did it. The Romans spoke of divide and conquer, and they had to do it too. And they began to create that division, which ultimately led to the partition of the disastrous partition of India into Pakistan and India, for example. So they will use any device. It just so happens in this region, sectarian religion is an Achilles heel, if you like, a weakness that they can exploit. And they have agents like the Saudis, the Ikhwanis, you know, the Qatar and so on, and of course Israel itself, to do that, to exploit that sort of difference there, and to try and normalize sectarian states, to promote independent Kurdish statelets like Israel, to normalize this idea that the Arab people or the Arabic Islamic people of this region are really tribal people. They're not modern people, and you can break them down into their sects and keep them divided. So in Latin America, you're right, it's different. But remember, they had the Contra Army used against Nicaragua in the 80s, and that had a lot of parallels with the use of al-Nusra and Daesh in Iraq and Syria, for example. They had the dirty wars in South America. That's what I stole that concept to give a title to my first book in this region, The Dirty War in Syria, because of the hybrid nature of the propaganda, the economic war, the various elements of that war, which were typically constructed by the liberal side of US imperialism. It was liberal imperialism that was more adept at creating that propaganda war and using other agents. You know, when Obama spoke of a new relationship with Islam in Cairo in 2009, many people were rather naive to take him at face value. But the North Americans have a very strong tradition going back hundreds of years of being able to turn language around. In this respect, they're a little bit different to the Europeans.
Yeah, actually this point will be raised with Dr. Scott, but after the break, as we conclude the first part of our episode, please stay with us. We will continue after the break. Thank you. Hello and welcome back on the second part of this episode. And we start with Dr. Scott. Well, you've been very courageous to write this book, Whistleblowing Report, in 2010, in which you proved the implication of the Obama administration and its previous, or its predecessor, the Bush administration, in financing terrorist groups such as ISIS. So I would like to ask you, and this is part of the attempt by the US to promote certain radical Islamist groups and use Islamophobia at the same time as a means to impose hegemony on the Arab Islamic region. I would like to hear from you regarding this issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the important things to understand that drives the American support of Zionism or the Jews or Israel is the notion of Christian Zionism. Yeah. And what that is a hijacking of Christianity and a infusing into traditional Christian dogma and biblical teaching this heresy, this lie, this deception that Israel and the Jews are necessary for Christians to transition into heaven. Yeah. That the Jews and Israel are blessed of God, they are the chosen people and must be protected and supported and financed everywhere. And it is a lie. It is not biblical. It is not Christian. I am Christian and I know it better than anyone. And this lie has been permeating into Christianity since the 1970s. And it has brainwashed Americans into thinking anything the Jews do, anything Israel does, they're one and the same. That's the other deception, that Jews and Zionists are one and the same. They're not. I was in Iran, and there were Jewish rabbis there who were against Zionism and did not believe in it and said, this is not Jewish. So to be in Iran with rabbis and Iranian mullahs really opened my eyes to see just the depth of the deception. So Christian Zionism is the first brainwashing that's done that most Americans are locked and shackled in, that need to be broken out. And there are many breaking out now. They realize this. But that is the great deception, is Jewish Zionism, and there are a lot of churches that back it. To your other point of the attempt to infuse a Abrahamic Judeo-Christian...
that was one of the issues that I wanted to ask you about. As, let's say, there was a creation of a certain Christian Zionism that won the conscience of the people in the West in order to support Israel. There is also another project now that is being promoted by the United States in the region, which is the Abrahamic religion. To what extent this is an attempt by the United States to create or generate Zionist Islam in order to also twist the conscience of the Muslim people so that they would be supportive to Israel?
Well, we have seen a concerted effort in the American intelligence community to try and redefine the Chinese as oppressing and killing Muslims. And that is intended to turn the Muslim populations against China, and in preparation for an American war against China that Americans, I think, the American government foolishly thinks it can engage in and win. I think there'd be a lot of problems. But the attempt to inflame the Muslim populations against China as being an atheistic, robotic people and culture that are communist and don't respect human rights and engage in organ harvesting and things like that. This is a very clear sign that the American military intelligence political shift is looking to weaponize the Muslims in Indonesia, in the different provinces of Pakistan and India against China, to contain China within the same fanaticism that the U.S. used to overthrow Gaddafi. The U.S. engaged in coordinated efforts, I know because I was part of it, the U.S. engaged in coordinated efforts with Saudi Arabia and Qatar to overthrow Gaddafi using the ISIS, U.S.-trained ISIS forces.
Yeah.
The United States gave them money, gave them weapons, trained them in Syria under Lloyd Austin.
And you were part of this.
I was part of it.
Eyewitness.
I can't say what I saw, what I did, but I can say I saw and I did a lot of things. And I was appalled, I was horrified, I was disgusted because I saw this, you're playing with fire that very easily could erupt into an inferno and engulf the world.
Yeah.
And we're now seeing that very fire destroying America. America, I think, is going to decay and break up into an archipelago of different states and different republics because of all the moral decadence that has taken and rotting the internal moral identity of America. So what we've been doing to the world is now coming back into the United States. I think that's another reason why the U.S. has betrayed Europe so badly, is to keep America afloat economically by enslaving Europe and weaponizing Russophobia into the Europeans.
No.
The same hatred, the same psychological warfare. The U.S. is masterful. Different application, different people, Russian Orthodox Christians.
Yeah.
But the U.S. is weaponizing Russophobia to weaponize Europeans and Ukrainians against Russia. They're weaponizing Islamophobia, in a sense, to weaponize the Muslims against China. And at the center of all of that, you see the Jewish, Israeli, Zionist hand pulling the strings. And that hand must be cut off.
Well, thank you very much for this broad perception of things. And I would like to move to Dr. Tim. Your latest book, Axis of Resistance Towards an Independent Middle East. So I advise everybody to try to buy it and read it. It's a very important book. And in this book, you're talking about an independent Middle East. To what extent the axis of resistance formed by Lebanese resistance, by Iran, Syria, and some resistance groups in Iraq and in Palestine could really withstand the attack that is multifold, multi-level, by the United States on the region. Part of it, it's military, part of it, it's cultural, ideological, even religious, as we talked about the attempt to generate Islamic Zionism under the banner of Abrahamic religions.
Yes, you're right. It's important to remember that cultural aspect of the war, but there's two main themes of that book, and the first one is that the various wars, there's at least 8, maybe 9 wars in the West Asian region, are a single war. They can't be understood separately, really. Palestine is at the heart of it, but the war on Syria, of course, which was notorious for being long and tremendous resistance and the constant adaptation, long-term propaganda, which is difficult. More effort has to be made in long-term propaganda because with Libya, for example, Libya was destroyed very quickly before that propaganda was exposed. But it was exposed and in a sense also disposed of, disposable propaganda. You see, after the destruction of Libya by NATO, they admitted most of the things that they were saying were false about Gaddafi and about the Libyan army. After the weapons of mass destruction scam in Iraq, the Rumsfelds and the Bushes of the world, they admitted that it was false and they laughed about it. It didn't matter. With Syria, for a decade of struggle, it kept mattering, and the myths of chemical...
And you have a book on the destruction of Syria. On the
the Dirty War on Syria was a prequel to that book, and in Western terms, not many people were writing books sympathetic to Syria back at that time. Now, perhaps people have lost interest around the world in Syria because of Ukraine and one thing and another. But what Syria demonstrated was the capacity of the talent. We shouldn't underestimate the capacities of the imperial power to sustain a long-term propaganda campaign. For example, in 2014, I think it was between August and September, October 2014, then Vice President Biden admitted that US allies were funding and arming all of the terrorist groups in Syria to try and overthrow Damascus. He admitted that. And the then head of the army, Martin Dempsey, the Senate leader of the Armed Forces Committee, Lindsey Graham, all admitted that, basically. But you would find now, 8 years later on, that they are still talking about, they are in Iraq for the war on ISIS and so on.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary that they could maintain the propaganda really effectively to diffuse the dissent in their own populations. That's mainly what it's about, to try and prevent an eruption of protest against the use of massive resources to carry out these wars based on deception. But they did that for a very long time with Syria, and now they're transferring that to China and Russia and Iran and so on. So it's really, this is quite novel in global history, I believe, this long-term deceptions and trying to diffuse people. It relies now on heavy censorship and climates of fear. There's a great climate of fear in the world today because of the few hundred people like Scott and myself who've been pushed out of our jobs or jailed or whatever for offending the Israelis. But we are examples to many thousands of other people who say, you raise your voice like Scott Bennett did in the US, and look what's going to happen to you. Put your head down and keep your children at school and keep your mortgages you're paying to the banks on your houses. So this climate of fear is associated with this powerful propaganda wave that's going on, and as has been said before, precisely to try and preserve a failing role in the world of the US, which is failing because of the rise of China, because of the rise of important other powers in the world, including in Latin America, including in Africa, including in West Asia, the rise of Iran. They're obsessed with Iran because it is the biggest, most powerful independent state in this region. And it's supporting the resistance in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. Let's not forget Yemen, also in Yemen too. So the propaganda war is far more intense because it is led by the liberal faction of US imperialism, which thinks with its smart power it can do much more than a pragmatic military person in the US Army might suspect. And I think that's one of the changes we've seen in in this century, let's say. If we look back at the 70s or 80s, they used to speak of hawks and doves. And the military people were meant to be the hawks who wanted to go to war. They were mad warmongers. And the diplomats who wanted to talk more, and resolve things, the liberals in a sense, were seen as the peacemakers. But now we have this doctrine of smart power and a common sense of US exceptionalism, that the laws of the world don't apply to the US. That in a way I think it's too simple to talk of simple hypocrisy. Double standards are built into any imperial culture. The laws that apply to everyone else, they have never applied to the US, whether you're liberal or whether you're on the pragmatic or realist side of things.
Well, in this sense, I want to ask you about resistance operations, let's say, initiated by individual Palestinians now, without any ideological background. They are just trying to resist. And you talked in this episode, earlier in this episode, about the fact that the Western audience accepts the Palestinians as passive victims rather than being active resistance. And we see that there is always an attempt to, let's say, relate any operation done to Islamic radicalism or to Hamas, even if it's not the case. So to what extent there is an attempt by the West to demonize any act of resistance and try to relate it to terrorism, quote unquote?
Yes, of course. And that's, again, it's an international phenomenon. You can say it's, they talk about Islamic terrorism or Arab terrorism. They're horrified if you talk about Jewish colonialization or Jewish crimes.
I want to mention in this regard that the Zionist society is moving more and more towards fascism, towards extreme radicalism and racism, and yet it's disregarded by the West, whereas we see that resistance or Palestinian resistance is always labeled as terrorism. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's a good point, but I have a slightly different view. I think you are right as regards occupied Palestine, that the fascist side, the openly fascist side of Zionism, is now in control in occupied Palestine. Now we're going back to another Netanyahu version of things, it seems, right now, where they're going to tear up this agreement that was provisionally made about maritime resources with Lebanon. But in the US in particular, where's the largest population of Jewish people and Israeli-aligned Jewish people, it's dominated by liberal Zionists.
Yeah.
They've typically voted Democrat in the US, not Republican. The Trump relationship with Netanyahu is something else, but that's with the more openly fascist side of Zionism, basically. And this is creating a problem for the Zionists because, you know, a lot of the liberal Zionists, their self-image is, we are liberal, tolerant people, anti-racist, you know, civilized, and so on and so on. You know, they were German, they were different sorts of Europeans, and so on. In fact, before the Second World War, most German Jews regarded themselves as Germans with Jewish religion. There wasn't this sense of a pseudo-racial idea of being a Jewish person. There's nothing ethnic about it. It's really a religious community, basically. But the tolerant liberal Jews were persuaded about the idea, against their better judgment, about the idea of a Jewish state in the late 40s. You find people like Albert Einstein, for example, he hated Likud, he hated Begin, those sorts of people. They recognized them as fascists and terrorists, but they were talked into the idea, after the Holocaust of the European Jews, they were talked into the idea of supporting Israel. But on the idea, they always had this myth that the Palestinians would not be badly treated, that there would be an Arab state, there would be a two-state solution, and so on and on. Now you have the open reality of a openly fascist-controlled, occupied Palestine, which has no interest in an Arab state or two states, and now in the last 2 years we have we have 4 more independent reports branding Israel as an apartheid regime, which under international law is a crime against humanity and must be dismantled, and the international community has an obligation to dismantle it. Now the fascists will say, who cares? This is our historic mission, and you know, their pseudo-racial theories and racial massacres reminiscent of all past fascist regimes. The liberal Zionists don't like that at all. They don't want to be part of it. You saw the Hollywood movie star Natalie Portman. They wanted to give her a $2 million prize a few years ago, but she hated Netanyahu so much she wouldn't go to Israel to accept the prize. Now she opposes boycott, divestment and sanctions, but practically speaking, that liberal faction of Jewish people, they really don't want to identify with the Netanyahus of the world, and they are now agitating against apartheid in Israel. And I think actually the resistance should be aware of this, because I think they will want to play a role in the dismantling of the apartheid system. And of course all the work is being done by the Palestinian resistance. It's the Palestinian resistance that is the engine of forcing this regime to declare its true colours and delegitimizing it in the eyes of the world and so on. But you would have to be wary, I suggest, that the liberal Zionist faction, which is now campaigning in the US, they have their own organisations, to former ministers or advisors in former Labour Israeli governments are now saying, listen, this system is out of control and it's hurting us. So there are contradictions within the Zionist community, that's what I'm trying to say, and they are being exacerbated by this lurch towards open fascism, as you say.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Scott, lately we witnessed in Brussels a demonstration organized by secular Marxist Palestinians and Europeans. But we saw that the mainstream media tried to label this as a Hamas-organized mass protest. So to what extent the propaganda of trying to label everything as, let's say, terrorist Hamas-led mass protest or organized movement is still effective, and to what extent these activists could, after a while, be able to make their touch and impose their logic and their identity let's say, bypassing all labels of terrorism and radical Islamic, let's say, led movements?
Well, I look at everything from the lens of a psychological warfare officer, influence operations. And to rhyme on a couple points Tim had raised, there's an interesting shift that's happening in so many different ways. There's an infusion of classical liberalism into the Israeli Zionist oppression of Palestine that may stop the militant fascism of the Netanyahu Oded Anon plan, which is at the heart of the expansion. The other aspect of influencing Europe and the protests that are happening, there's so much suffering that is happening in Europe and that is going to accelerate, that it's going to cultivate the minds to be receptive for all sorts of new revolutionary possibilities and turns. You already see the downfall of Boris Johnson. You already see the fall of Liz Truss. You're going to see the fall of Rishi. You're going to see the fall of Macron. You're going to see the fall of Ursula von Leyen and Schultz and all of these globalists that have sacrificed their own European people for their own globalist agenda, which is rooted in a lot of leftist globalist ideology of climate change and all sorts of other perverse ideas from a conservative point of view that are destined to fail. That's creating a great deal of instability and nervousness. I think all of the old labels from before and the terms and the slogans are not sticking anymore. They're not having a penetrating effect. There's a great awakening that's happening globally, and the internet is fueling a lot of that. It's communication, it's influence, it's people from different lands and different ideas being able to go and pollinate other people's thinkings in different ways. I, for example, was at the conference with Tim last night, and I met several members of Hamas, and I found them very wonderful men, very kind, very loving people that have endured great hardships. And I found a parallel because I'm from originally Scotland. Yeah. And the Scottish fought oppression from the English, and the Scottish were enslaved, and the Scottish were sent to Australian prison camps, and the Scottish fought back, much like the Palestinians have fought back, much like Hamas has fought back, much like Hezbollah and other groups have stood up against oppression. And when you've lost your mother or father or your home or your son, or you've been thrown in prison by invaders and fascists, you have a right to stand up and fight by all means necessary. And that's another sympathetic point. The American people would find more sympathy in the Palestinian rise to reject tyranny than they would with the Israeli Zionist mode to conquer and colonize under the flag of Christian Zionism. That epoch, that era is being eclipsed. So we're at the point of a great eclipse. We're seeing yesterday being eclipsed by tomorrow, and what will emerge is a multipolar world with Russia, China, Iran, India, several of the South American countries as independent of the Western British EU hemisphere. Now, as the EU and the Western powers wane, you will have an economic collapse, you will have an economic redefinition. I think this is inevitable, and you may have also a lot of desperate acts of false flag attacks and conquest and violence. So we have to be prepared for anything.
Well, we're about to reach the end of our episode. I would like to conclude with Dr. Tim. To what extent Palestine could be the link between a regional axis of resistance that is trying to counter U.S. hegemony on the regional level with an international anti-imperialist movement against the U.S. hegemony?
Yes, I think those international links are very important. And of course, in my view, the regional wars here against Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, also in Yemen, are really all intended to fragment the region so they do not form a strong alliance which will lead to the liberation of Palestine. or the dismantling of Palestine, because in many respects I think there will be a surrender at a time when there's a very strong axis of resistance. It will be about the terms of surrender, the terms of dismantling, and then we have to be aware of all of the other players that have a say in that, because there are dangers in the dismantling of Israel too, which is to say that there's going to be, along the lines of the dismantling of racial regimes in Zimbabwe and South Africa, you see compromises made about special privileges for settlers, the freezing of land relations, freezing of property relations, the compromises struck about the rights of exile population to return to Palestine. Those details will become very important. But all that presupposes a weak region at war, divided amongst itself. Now, in the course of this war, of course, as we've been saying today, the globalization of resistance has really arisen in face of the globalization of these multiple wars, basically. And so while the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is reaching out to this region, that is to say from the Levant to Shanghai, I believe we're going to see important links between the Levant and Shanghai as a part of this. But it's also internationalized in the sense that the BRICS organization already was founded with strong Latin American and African partners, and now there's quite a rapid expansion accelerated by the will of China, by the new leadership in Brazil, for example, and the new relationship between Colombia and Venezuela. So some of those intercontinental links will become important in creating viable economic blocks to escape from the powerful control of the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, dollar, SWIFT system, because that's very necessary. You know, the nations of this region are being strangled because they can't escape the banking dictatorship that's being carried out by the US through the SWIFT system, for example. Now the big powers like China and Russia are creating these mechanisms which will allow, for example, a strangled country like Lebanon, like Syria, to actually start to trade and have investment and so on. Again, those things are very important. And the wider that bloc grows, the more internationalized it is in terms of commerce and investment and collaboration, the integration of infrastructure, you know, of transport, of communications, of energy links. You know, the great fear of the Zionists has been what they call an Iranian land bridge. You know, the idea that you have this integrated transport, which they love to have in Europe, they love to have in North America, but they don't want to see it between Tehran and the Levant. But they even less want to see it between the Levant and Shanghai. So I think that's the future, and I think that's some of the hopeful things in the future. And this will, of course, Palestine is sitting there at the heart of this, because the proxy of the US imperialism to me is the Zionist colony there. It doesn't control the imperial dog, I don't believe. I think it's a Zionist tail on the imperial dog. I know I have some differences with colleagues about that, but it's a very important Zionist tale, and it's at the core of the destabilization and the problems that the people of this region suffer. And it has to be an important part of the globalization of resistance.
Well, Dr. Tim Anderson, thank you for all your comments and for accepting our invitation to be part of this episode. I would like also to thank Dr. Scott Bennett for accepting our invitation, and I would like to remind the public, the audience, about two important books by Dr. Tim Anderson, Axis of Resistance Towards an Independent Middle East, and Whistleblowing Report by Dr. Scott Bennett. I advise you to read these books and hope to see you next time in another episode. So please wait for us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
يقدموا لنا الأمل، نقدم لهم الحب. تتابع المشاكل الخدمية.